Welcome and good afternoon to everybody. Ms. Spatolisano, Assistant Secretary General for Economic and Social Affairs, Ms. Beagle, Director General of IDLO, Honorable Ministers, Excellencies, distinguished guests, delegates, ladies and gentlemen. Whether you are physically present in the room or you are following us online, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the opening of the SDG 16 conference on people-centered governance in a post-pandemic world. I particularly wish to thank the partners and co-organizers of this event, the United Nations Department on Economic and Social Affairs, represented by Assistant Secretary General Maria-Francesca Spatolisano, and the International Development Law Organization, represented by Director General Beagle. Likewise, I wish to thank the President of the United Nations General Assembly, Abdulla Shahid, the President of the UN Economic and Social Council, Collen, Vixen, Kelapile, and the UN Deputy Secretary General Amina, Mohammed, for their contributions to this conference by video messages. This is the third edition of our conference. Over the last 3 years, we have sought to keep implementation of SDG 16 high on the international agenda. Indeed, we have done so through very challenging times. The pandemic has been a stress test for governments and institutions, putting their capacity to provide essential services under pressure. Moreover, the events of the last 2 months have shown the extreme relevance of SDG 16 in the current international context, with its goal of peace, justice, and strong institutions. Italy proudly hosts this conference, which at this point has become a consolidated yearly landmark for all those who work in the fields of peace building and development. The pursuit of SDG 16 is pivotal, as it is an enabler of other SDGs. Since the early negotiations of the 2030 Agenda, we have in fact been committed to support the need to bridge peace and development through the pillars of good governance, justice, fundamental freedoms, human rights, and the rule of law. Good governance, in particular, shapes and seals the social pact between people and institutions, an essential step in order to create an environment where the other pillars, justice, the rule of law, human rights, and fundamental freedoms, can thrive. Institutions, on the other hand, are fundamental drivers of development. Social conflicts, isolation, inequalities, and exclusion cannot be faced without good governance, both at local and global levels. The COVID-19 pandemic has increased social tensions, inequalities, and corruption, causing polarization, disinformation, and greater difficulties in access to fundamental rights such as justice. In other words, the pandemic has brought distrust towards institutions to an unprecedented level. However, there is also a margin of opportunity we must not miss. The need for good governance is now more important and pressing than ever. An equitable, just, and sustainable post-pandemic recovery requires institutional legitimacy and accountability at all levels. Moreover, a just recovery also implies the necessity to continue tackling gender inequality. Women and girls are still left behind with lower chances to enjoy their rights, too often watching their fundamental right of access to justice being silenced and denied. Building resilience to future shocks and crises can only start by renewing the social contract to rebuild trust between people and state. Indeed, I am pleased to note that so many distinguished policy makers held of multilateral organizations. Representatives from civil society and academia are participating in this conference in order to undertake a multi-stakeholder assessment of the impact of the pandemic on progress towards SDG 16. Your collective work will be the key stepping stone towards the 2022 high-level political forum in New York next July. Your thoughts and recommendations will be crucial to rethink governance with SDG 16 at its center, especially in the difficult circumstances left by the COVID-19 pandemic. Collective actions for improved governance offer the most sustainable approach to recovery and to leave no one behind. Ladies and gentlemen, this will be our task for the next 2 days. I wish you all productive and fruitful discussion. Thank you very much. And now I change the hat. As I mentioned before, the conference has been honored to receive video messages from speakers that could not join us today. We will first hear from the President of the General Assembly, Mr. Abdulla Shahid.
Colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for graciously inviting me to speak at this important conference, which I believe will effectively contribute to the work of the 2022 High-Level Political Forum. I was invited to discuss the Secretary General's Our Common Agenda report, and specifically the processes geared towards advancing the report's proposals in the General Assembly. As many of you are aware, the Secretary General's report requested by member states was born from the recommendations and findings collected during the UN's 75th anniversary commemoration. Beginning with the publication of the report in September 2021 and followed by the adoption of Resolution 76/6 in November, the membership of the General Assembly has been focused on the many proposals contained within the Secretary General's report. Specifically, member states mandated me as President of the General Assembly to initiate a follow-up process to the OCA report, a process by which member states and relevant partners could consider the various proposals and options. Accordingly, my office has convened 5 rounds of thematic consultations. This consisted of plenary discussions with more than 350 statements from member states and observers and 10 panel discussions. Over these 5 thematic consultations, we have heard not only from member states and observers of the General Assembly, but also from senior representatives of the UN system and other relevant partners, including the private sector, the academia, civil society, and youth. We are now in the process of finalizing summaries of proceedings from these consultations. These will reflect the views expressed by member states and may also include recommendations about steps forward, outlining pathways to proceed further with the OCA report. Ladies and gentlemen, with regard to the specific theme of this conference on people-centered governance in a post-pandemic world, I mentioned that during those OCA thematic consultations, delegations echoed the Secretary General's call for a new global deal that redresses inequalities and rebalances resources. Accordingly, they emphasized the global dimensions of this social contract. They were particularly enthusiastic for more details on the proposals around a social contract anchored in human rights. This makes me optimistic that member states will draw up on a spirit of justice and compassion as they consider the path forward. My friends, our recent history has been a tumultuous period. A pandemic and an armed conflict have shaken our global norms and institutions. The armed conflict in Ukraine dealt successive blows to a global economy already damaged by COVID-19. And the world continues to be appalled by the scale of human tragedy wrought by this and other conflicts around the world. In the wake of such shock and economic anxiety, our societies are becoming more polarized. As divisions grow and differences deepen, increasing the potential for future strife. Rarely has the need to promote peace, justice, and inclusive societies been more important. Without them, we cannot achieve any of our sustainable development goals. We must take concerted action now to reorient ourselves away from this unsustainable and destructive path. We must put aside our differences and act for the common good. We must strengthen the institutions necessary for our societies to prosper and live in peace in the spirit of SDG 16. I believe that the membership of the United Nations system is up to the task. Working alongside each other and other stakeholders, we can undertake a global recovery that strengthens SDG 16 and makes progress across the entirety of the 2030 agenda. My office will continue the work of taking forward the proposals and options related to our common agenda in an inclusive and transparent manner. With those sentiments, I wish you a very productive conference, and I thank you.
Our next message is from the President of ECOSOC, His Excellency Mr. Collen, Vixen, Kelapile.
Excellencies, distinguished delegates, observers, and participants. It is my sincere pleasure to be with you at the opening of the 2022 edition of the SDG 16 conference. I warmly welcome you all to this important conference. I wish at the outset to acknowledge the invaluable contribution that the previous editions of this conference made in reviewing progress on SDG 16 and providing inputs to the deliberations of the High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development, the HLPF. As you are aware, the 2022 theme of the Council and the HLPF is Building Back Better from the coronavirus disease, COVID-19, while advancing the full implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. This broad theme is more than just a slogan. It reflects a high level of ambition at a time of great need against the backdrop of unprecedented challenges. We must therefore not fall short of expectations. The High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development and the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations are determined to continue their global push to respond to the negative impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. And despite the monumental challenges brought by the pandemic and the climate crisis, move quickly to reach all the SDGs within this decade of action and delivery for sustainable development. The theme of this conference, People-Centered Governance in a Post-Pandemic World, is at the heart of the challenges we face today. Interlinkages between SDG 16 and other SDGs capture the essence of the 2030 Agenda as a universal and indivisible roadmap to our common future. The transformative vision of the 2030 Agenda calls for new thinking and new ways of working. One cannot hope to build a better future for all with the same old patterns of behavior, from the international level to the national level, in the public sector, and in society as a whole to the local level. It is those ingrained habits that have led us to where we are today. The question then is, what do we mean by transforming governance? The four sub-themes of this conference cover critical facets of this problem. First, without peace, there cannot be sustainable development. Conflicts claim many lives, adversely affect basic human rights, exacerbate inequalities, hamper the delivery of basic services such as shelter and food, and further exclude women and girls, youth, and other groups living in conditions of vulnerability from participation in society. Over the past year, we have seen growing violence and conflict as the pandemic has exposed and exacerbated tensions within and between countries. I hope that you will examine approaches to build and sustain development in conflict-affected contexts, including for the most vulnerable. Second, in order to address our current challenges, the rule of law and access to justice are paramount. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the justice gap has continued to widen. The pandemic has aggravated the impact of corruption on public finances and has also opened new avenues for corruption. These challenges compel governments and the international community to take a hard look at these issues and to strengthen the rule of law to effectively prevent and combat corruption and enable the less powerful to claim their rights. Third, it is critical to make institutions at all levels more inclusive and more resilient to shocks. Lessons learned from the pandemic must be translated into institutions and mechanisms that ensure the delivery of key public services to all, including health and education. Ways must also be found to make public institutions collaborate better amongst themselves, and most importantly, to enable the engagement of people and civil society, which has proved to be critical during the pandemic. Responsiveness is a key word here. It has to be accompanied by improved transparency and accountability. In all this, public servants and the public service will have to play a key role. Equipping them with new mindsets, competencies, and tools to address these challenges should be a top priority. Fourth, leaving no one behind remains a cardinal principle for the achievement of the 2030 agenda. This has become more apparent during the pandemic. As we have all observed, the impacts of the pandemic exacerbated the dire human and social impacts of inequalities and exclusion in multiple dimensions. It is therefore more urgent than ever to address inequality in a structural, multi-pronged way. During the pandemic, many countries have innovated to expand social protection systems, to continue to provide access to education and basic services, to support workers and entrepreneurs, and to develop digital government. We need much more to prevent and reverse adverse impacts of the crisis on women and girls and on vulnerable groups. We need much more to give voice to the youth. And we need much more to make the participation of all in the decisions that concern them a reality. Transforming governance is easier than said than done. As a prerequisite, we need genuine dialogue among all those involved, from governments to civil society to other actors. In conclusion, I appreciate the multi-stakeholder nature of this conference, and I look forward to the conclusions of your deliberations. It will inform the debate of the high-level political forum on sustainable development in July. I thank you for your kind attention.
And now let us hear from the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, Ms. Amina Mohammed.
I send my warm greetings to everyone participating in this conference on SDG 16. The global challenges we face are immense, from providing equitable access to vaccines to securing peace for millions of people affected by conflict and violence, addressing unsustainable levels of debt, combating the climate crisis, and tackling entrenched and growing inequalities. Over the past 24 months, COVID-19 has caused tremendous human suffering. It has threatened and reversed development gains, with the greatest impact falling on those already living in conditions of vulnerability, exclusion, and fragility. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and its promise to leave no one behind are a blueprint for the recovery from the pandemic, guiding our path towards a better future. SDG 16 is an essential enabler of the entire 2030 agenda and its promise of peace, stability, respect for human rights, and effective institutions based on the rule of law. Success calls for a new era of governance. In his report on our common agenda, the Secretary General stressed the overwhelming need for a renewed social contract anchored in human rights to reduce inequalities and build trust between people and governments. A renewed social contract should be based on people-centered governance, securing the participation of all in decisions that concern them and opening up new spaces for engagement with all stakeholders. It includes investment in social cohesion, an end to all forms of exclusion, discrimination and racism, access to justice for all, and a recommitment to the rule of law. Innovation will be key in this new era. By nurturing new modes of thinking and embracing new technologies and ideas, government decision-making, service provision, and interaction with citizens can be improved, expanded, and deepened. We must not neglect the potential that innovative tools from big data analytics to predictive algorithms and machine learning can have on the ability of governments to improve people's lives if properly harnessed. With less than 8 years to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, we need bold action now. Strong, accountable institutions build resilient societies that can withstand shocks and crises and contribute to a safer world for all. I wish you a successful conference, and I look forward to hearing about your discussions. Thank you.
It is now my pleasure to give the floor to Maria-Francesca Spatolisano, Assistant Secretary General for Policy Coordination and Interagency Affairs of the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, who will deliver opening remarks on behalf of the Under-Secretary General Zhenmin. Maria-Francesca, you have the floor.
Your Excellency Marina Sereni, Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, Director General of the International Development Law Organization, Beagle, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to welcome you all to the SDG 16 Conference 2022 on people-centered governance in a post-pandemic world. I thank the government of Italy and the IDLO for joining with us again to organize this global event. 1 year ago, the SDG 16 conference highlighted the great challenges caused by the COVID-19 pandemic to all the Sustainable Development Goals, with a focus on SDG 16. During the past 12 months, inequalities have continued to rise, accompanied by increased food insecurity and poverty. Today, the challenges we face have become even more complex. Peace, the basic requirement for sustainable development, has been challenged more than ever. The path to recovery from the global economic crisis brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic has been further complicated by the conflict in Ukraine. Reaching and supporting the most vulnerable should be a key focus of all government policies. Distinguished participants, 2 years of the pandemic have also taken a toll on public institutions, both directly and through the impact on increasingly limited fiscal space in most countries. Health systems have been weakened and education has suffered enormous damages. Yet, effective public institutions are more needed than ever. They are the cornerstone of national responses to emergencies. They are responsible for mitigating crises and continuing to deliver public services. They are expected to respond effectively to the need of citizens, especially in times of crisis. How to make institutions better prepared and more resilient to shocks should be a key concern in all countries. Improving the resilience of public institutions must be anchored in a multi-pronged strategy. It calls for mobilizing data and science, incorporating foresight exercises into planning, and equipping public organizations and their staff with the right competencies and skills. It requires effective collaboration across government departments and levels of government, ensuring transparency and accountability around crisis response and beyond, and fighting corruption. But building effective public institutions goes beyond internal coherence. It requires engagement and innovation from other parts of the society, a fact that the pandemic has made very clear. Transforming governance and public institutions in this way is undoubtedly a tall order. Yet, during the past 2 years, innovations have multiplied to make public institutions more effective and, in some cases, more inclusive. Public servants have played a critical role during the pandemic. Many countries have quickly adopted digital government tools, but we have to work harder to bridge the digital divides and make digital government a positive force for inclusion. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope that your deliberations will distill useful lessons from policy changes made by countries during the pandemic to establish universal social protection systems, provide legal identity to all, enhance access to education, housing, and decent work opportunities for those in vulnerable situations, and increase digital inclusivity. I also look forward to your concrete ideas for accelerating gender equality, building on forward-looking initiatives on the repeal of gender discriminatory laws, changing damaging social norms, and greater engagement of women in all spheres of decision-making, as well as eradicating violence against women and girls. Distinguished participants, the critical importance of SDG 16 to a successful recovery from the present pandemic and for building resilience to future crises cannot be emphasized enough. The world has less than 9 years to implement the ambitious 2030 agenda. Advancing SDG 16 will help us not only to build back better, but also accelerate progress on all the SDGs. This conference represents a unique opportunity to make it happen. I am pleased to see that many leaders from governments, international organizations, civil society, and academia have joined us for these 2 days. This multi-stakeholder setting will, I'm sure, greatly help advance our understanding of opportunities as well as lessons learned to move forward Sustainable Development Goal 16. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ms. Spatolisano. I am pleased now to give the floor to Ms. Beagle, Director General of International Development Law Organization. Ms. Beagle, the virtual floor is yours. I hope you are connected.
Yes. Vice Minister Sereni, Assistant Secretary General Spatolisano, Excellencies, friends and colleagues, on behalf of IDLO, it is a great pleasure to welcome you to the 2022 SDG 16 conference. And I would like to thank the government of Italy and UNDESA for their continued partnership in this very important event. We are meeting at a critical moment. Over the past 2 years, COVID-19 has had a monumental impact on global development, placing decades of hard-won progress under threat. Millions of people have died, and millions more have been pushed into poverty and insecurity. with the most severe impact falling on the most vulnerable. And at the same time, there has been a growing global backlash against human rights, multilateralism, and democratic governance. We have seen repeated attempts to undermine the rule of law and the systems that uphold it. New and emerging conflicts continue to pose a threat to international peace and security, with some of the worst violations of human rights taking place where the rule of law is absent or has broken down. The war in Ukraine is the latest in a long list of global crises, and yet another example of the urgent need to act swiftly and robustly to defend SDG 16. And the past few years have seen a steep decline in financing for rule of law in national budgets and international development assistance, just when it is needed the most. The world is even further off track to reach all the SDGs by 2030. So this conference is an opportunity to assess ways in which a people-centered approach to governance can help tackle these challenges. Allow me to share 3 important ways in which it can do so, drawing on IDLO's experience. First, people-centered governance can help accelerate progress on SDG 16, which is vital to the realization of all the SDGs. Goal 16 is broad, containing many seemingly diverse objectives, but it is tied together with the common thread of good governance. Its 3 pillars, peaceful and inclusive societies, access to justice, and effective, accountable institutions, serve as a crucial foundation for the entire 2030 agenda. Many SDGs implicitly draw on the principles of inclusivity, equity, and non-discrimination, and require the creation of new regulatory and legal frameworks and institutional capacity for their implementation. And the rule of law is a cross-cutting enabler for all 17 SDGs. It advances the type of institutional mechanisms and fair, rules-based processes needed to promote the integrated whole-of-society approaches required for sustainable peace and development. This point is made clear in the Secretary General's Our Common Agenda, which calls for a new vision for the rule of law to help renew the social contract and respond to global challenges. Second, a people-centered approach to governance is key to rebuilding trust. We are witnessing a crisis of confidence in public institutions of unprecedented proportions. COVID-19 has further eroded already low levels of public trust, creating a social and political crisis alongside a health and economic one. The rule of law is crucial to restoring this trust and renewing the social contract between citizens and the state. By empowering justice seekers and promoting participatory governance, the rule of law leads to more open and equitable decisions. Through strong, transparent, and people-centered institutions, it helps ensure that services and opportunity are distributed in a way that is fair and non-discriminatory. And that is essential to rebuilding trust in governance and strengthening the social contract. And third, it can help to address the complex transnational challenges that traditional instruments of statecraft are ill-equipped to handle. The last 2 years have highlighted that our most urgent problems, from COVID-19 to climate change, do not stop at borders and are too big and too complex for any of us to solve alone. We need to innovate and build laws and institutions that will allow countries and peoples to transition to a greener, more climate resilient and equitable development model. Putting people and their human rights at the center of this effort will be essential. So this conference presents an opportunity to build momentum and to increase political and financial support for SDG 16 as a central lever for transformation. I look forward to continued collaboration towards our shared vision of equitable and inclusive societies and sustainable peace and development for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Beagle. Thank you very much to all the speakers who have provided remarks during this session. I can now declare the conference officially opened and shall hand the floor to Ms. Ilaria Bottigliero, Director for Policy, Research and Learning at IDLO. We will be the moderator of the first session. I also invite the speakers of the first session to turn their cameras on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vice Minister. And let's take just a couple of minutes to sanitize